The Experience of Thinking. A series of talks on change of consciousness in the writings of European philosophers by John Thompson. Episode 14. Martin Buber.
We're going to talk about a philosopher. And so, what is philosophy? What does it do? Why is it there? Who does it? It's a good question. Not everybody feels that they want to enter into philosophy because it seems rather abstract, not very connected with real life or all sorts of things, and in the hands of very intelligent people who talk a language that nobody else understands. Well, that could be one way of looking at it. On the other hand, we have a long tradition in Europe of what we call philosophy and philosophers. It goes back at least 2,500 years to the Greeks, and they started asking questions. Now, if we look out in the world, there are many things that we don't understand, and that we then start to inquire, well, how has this come about, and so on. And these are the sort of questions that these philosophers started to ask. And one of the main questions that they put in front of themselves, well, if we look out in the world, it's so diverse, there are so many different things in the world, people, animals, plants, stars, clouds, all so endless variety of things out there. And yet they all seem to be in some way connected to each other. In some way, if sunlight comes down there and warms the earth, and the birds are able to spread their wings and look for seeds, and so everything seems to be in some way interconnected. So if they are, what is it that connects them? What brings them up, makes a unity out of a diversity? So that was one of the questions. Then, later on, and we come to then Plato and Aristotle, Greece was made up of communities living in small cities. They called a polis, city. And living in a city, then you have all sorts of questions that arise in a community about good and evil. What is it to be good and not good? Or what is it to be a person who's virtuous? Or even, what is it to be a community? What is it? So they were asking these questions. And then they were asking questions as, how does one come to know things? So these kind of questions descended right through the generations in many different ways, which we've tried to go into in the past. And now we come to the century we live in. And the same questions are still there. Now, before I talk about Martin Buber, I want to take you into a conference that happened in New York during the Second World War. Now, you realize, and during the Second World War, that's 1939 to 45, the whole world, East and West, was in turmoil, terrible turmoil. And that was only going to end in 45. But during 1942, in New York, a number of the most brilliant scientists in the West decided to get together and see if, by collaborating, they could come to new understandings and new ways of going forward if they began to cooperate instead of the physicists staying in physics and so on. So there was a brilliant, an utterly brilliant group of people who assembled in these conferences. There were quite a number of them, but they started in 1942, I think, in New York. And they were called the Macy Conferences. They'd tackled many things. There were physicists, chemists, engineers, mathematicians, sociologists, all of them, and all coming together and debating, showing what they're doing and seeing if there are connections. And one of these was particularly interested in its own development. And these people were called cyberneticists. It's about controlling mechanisms. How do you control things? For example, you might look at a machine, and in some they've developed machines which are self-controlling. But how does an animal? Maybe the animal is also self-controlled by the food it sees. It's bound to do something in relationship to that. And maybe human beings also are controlled by what we see or what we hear or so on. And then they wanted to see if we could make mechanisms that would bridge this a world out there and the world of the mind, which is centered in the brain. Could they bring them together? And then they would solve what the philosophers had been struggling with all over these 2,000 years, what we would call the mind-body problem. How does the mind get hold of what's out there the body makes visible to us through eyes, ears, tongue, etc.? And so they hoped that by means of engineering, cybernetics, the new science of mind-brain study, they would be able to make this bridge between the outer and the inner, the brain. And that, of course, goes on right till today. So I mentioned that as a kind of contrast with what I'm going to talk about, that is a very strong drive in the modern world. The man I'm going to talk about, Martin Buber, has a very special importance for me. Just after the war, I was in the university in Edinburgh, and a book appeared which had been translated from German about 2 or 3 years before, and the translator, I saw in a notice, was coming to Edinburgh to talk about this book. And that immediately interested me. And I was at that lecture and I bought the book, I read the book and so on, and it made a great impression on me. And I'm not quite sure why, because he was a philosopher, but he wasn't like any other philosopher that I'd come across. Although in Edinburgh there was a professor of moral philosophy who was very sympathetic to what Buber was bringing. And so there was a kind of welcoming atmosphere in those years after the war where everybody was hating each other and afraid and so on. And now we were into a new world and we were opening to what we hoped would be new understandings of each other. This feeling of sympathy or empathy with what this man was writing about remained with me right up to today. And so when I had to reread this talk I gave 15 years ago, I was suddenly back in the world that I remembered when I was in my 20s, you know. I think I realized that for the first time, philosophy became a question of how do you live rather than how clever are you or how do you know the world. It wasn't about knowledge. It was also about knowledge, but not only about knowledge. And of course, the theme that we're going to tackle together in this philosopher's work is the theme of dialogue, of meeting. Now, as that I want to share with you. First of all, I'll maybe say a word about Martin Buber. Martin Buber was born in Poland and the date is 1878. So he's Steiner would be a young man at university when he was born. He grew up in Poland, but he spoke German, and then he was educated in Poland, and then when his parents divorced, he decided to go to Germany, and then he remained in Germany and studied, and not only studied, but became a lecturer in German universities and so on. And he was very committed to the Hebrew tradition. He was very influenced by a Hebrew sect that lived somewhere in Poland or the edge of Russia, and they practiced a kind of cult in which they were very pious, and but they also, although they were very devoted in their attitude to the world, they were also very joyful and loving and so on. And so they wrote many stories, like you get stories from the Japanese and stories from all sorts of others. And these are special stories which I read, which Buber actually had translated and formed, and I remember reading them, but I don't remember the stories now. That's such a long time ago. So that shaped him in a certain way, but also other people, philosophers in Germany and France and so on, also had an influence on him, which we can't go into. And then in 1923, he produced this book, and it's called I and Thou. I decided that since it's written in such an unusual way, it's not easy to turn it into a kind of my way of putting it, because he has such a special way of putting it. And I'm going to do quite a bit of reading, but we'll pause and look and see what is he meaning by that. And I think in that way, we can come to an understanding of what appealed to me and which I'm trying to transmit to you in some way. When you hear it, you won't hear it like a description of other philosophers who begin with certain ideas and show the foundation of these ideas and how they're well grounded and so on. And on that, they build certain concepts and views and so on. It's not at all like that. He simply asserts something. He just says, this is it. This is it. And what does he say? Well, he makes his own language. And so you've got to make it into your language. You might say, and people have complained about Buber, that he's more a poet than a philosopher, that he's more living in creating a kind of mythology or whatever you like. It's not really serious philosophy. But at the same time, his influence has spread into many, many areas of education, therapy, and philosophy too. He was teaching in a university during the Nazi period. And in 1938, Jews were not allowed to teach in universities, so he left and went to Israel. Now, Israel at that time wasn't a state. It was run by the British as part of their empire, special part that they had taken over in 1918. And Jews were already looking towards going back to Israel out of a movement specially developed then called Zionism. So he was drawn there. He knew the leader of the Zionists, and he himself was a Zionist. But he continued, when he got to Israel, to develop his ideas on what we're going to study now. But I've confined myself to really mainly quotations from this original book, which he wrote in 1923 and which I read in 1948 in a translation. Now listen. To man, the world is twofold, in accordance with his twofold attitude. The attitude of man is twofold in accordance with the twofold nature of the primary words which he speaks. The primary words are not isolated words, but combined words. The one primary word is the combination I-thou. The other primary word is the combination I-it, wherein, without a change in the primary word, one of the words, he and she, can replace it. Hence, the I of man is also twofold. For the I of the primary word I-thou is a different I from that of the primary word I-it. Primary words do not signify things, but they intimate relations. Primary words do not describe something that might exist independently of them, but being spoken, they bring about existence. Primary words are spoken from the being. If thou is said, the I of the combination I-thou is said along with it. If it is said, the I of the combination I-it is said along with it. The primary word I-thou can only be spoken with the whole being. The primary word I-it can never be spoken with the whole being. Normally, you look for the philosopher and they ground themselves on the problem of I, and then there's a world out there. How do they connect? But he says that's not the origin. The humanity has never been isolated I looking at a world. Humanity has always been related. It's always been a relationship to the other, to the world, to nature, to the gods, if you like, or to the angels, whatever. It's always been in relationship. It has never been I'm here, and there's the world. What's this world out there? That's not reality. We must ground ourselves in the reality of the human being, which is a relationship. Now, you can't step outside the relationship and say, every time you say I, it's in relationship. So he's standing on a very different ground from the whole tradition of European philosophy. I'm not talking about Eastern philosophy because I think that brings in all rather new questions. I'm comparing it with the tradition that has held here for 2,500 years. And he's challenging that out of his own Jewish traditions, partly, but also he's read everything in Western philosophy, everything from Plato right up to the moderns and all the ones in between, and made very wonderful comments on them. So he's not an isolated Jewish scholar who's trying to tell us something new. He's someone who stands right in the middle of European philosophy and culture, art, music, everything. That's his. He's German as well as Jewish, and German in some ways a center of European culture in some ways, with France and so on. And he's all part of that. So he's drawing something from his own Hebrew background, but he's awakening it, if he can, it seems to me anyway, in the minds and hearts of all Europeans. Relationship and dialogue, meeting, are the essence, are the cradle in which we are based. So it begins, and the remaining 100 or so pages is a development from an exposition of these ideas, of these lines. That's what I'm going to try and do, just expose and explain and develop these basic ideas. Now, what are these two primary words? The two primary words are I, thou, and the other one, I, it. So it's I, thou, second person, the one you meet. And the question of thou in English, we don't use thou as a modern English word, and sometimes translated by I, you. But for me, that's not adequate, because thou is only used in one situation in modern English, the prayer, thy will be done. And we've reserved it for that. Now, why did it disappear? Because we used to say thou in English. When did it disappear? In Yorkshire, it's still in the dialect, but in the central culture, it disappeared. When? Shakespeare. In Shakespeare, it's already moved to you. And what is the difference between thou and you? What is the difference? In German and French, it's clear. Du and sie. Tu and vous. It's very clear for French people. In fact, French, when they come to English and they don't have a du, a tu, they feel something missing. I don't know if other people feel that. I don't know if in Japanese also, I'm sure, there's maybe a difference. But anyway, in English, it disappeared. And that's to be a very significant thing, because that takes away the hierarchy. In one sense, it makes us all, the distance between one and the other, all the same. Whereas if you say tu, the distance is closer. And if you say vous, then it's higher or whatever. But that disappears in the English language. But to me, it belongs here as I and thou, not I and you. Okay? The I stands separate from the world it relates to. The use is the user of objects in the everyday. The object as a means to an end. Objects of study or of research. That's the separated I. And that is in our relationship to everything we use, whether it's physical or an animal or plant or human being. If we use it, the relationship is I-it. There's a distance. The attitude characterizes our general tendency of making use of things or even of people. The life of human beings is not passed in the sphere of transitive verbs alone. It doesn't exist in virtue of activities alone, which have some thing for their object. I perceive something. I am sensible of something. I imagine something. I will something. I find something. I think something. The life of human beings does not consist of all this and the like alone. This and the like together establish the realm of it. But the realm of thou has a different basis. When thou is spoken, the speaker has no thing for his object, for where there is a thing, there is another thing. Every it is bounded by others. It exists alone through being bounded by others. But when thou is spoken, there is no thing. Thou has no bounds. When thou is spoken, the speaker has no thing. He has indeed nothing, but he takes his stand in relation. It is said that man experiences his world. What does this mean? Man travels over the surface of things and experiences them. He extracts knowledge about their constitution from them. He wins an experience from them. He experiences what belongs to the things. But the world is not presented to man by experience alone. These present him only with a world composed of it, and he and she, and it again. Sacred things, things reserved for the initiated, are still things. Experiencing is not taking part in the world, and the world has no part in the experience. Experience, I it. Relation, I thou. Now, that I thou, we can perhaps grasp in its relationship to another person. He's not making moral judgments. He's merely saying, this is the world we relate to. And we've got two ways of relating to it. He's not saying this is good and this is bad. In fact, we couldn't exist without I, it. It's what we do, how we prepare a meal, how we walk somewhere, drive a car. This is all I, it. But of course, we need that. So he's talking about a world that is always intermovement. I, it. But then, if we never have I, thou, then we're living in a barren world. But we'll come to that later, okay? He also talks about an I, thou with nature. And then I, thou with the other person, and I, thou with intelligible forms. And then you ask yourself, what does he mean by an I, thou relationship with nature? I want to read you something in a moment, which is, I think, quite extraordinary and relates to this picture. He himself makes comments on it, and he talks about his relationship to his cat. But I think even a domesticated animal is quite different, again, from the real otherness of nature, which can also become a thou. Well, he considers a tree. I'll just say this, because it's like a picture. Everything's in movement, the leaves, the branches, and so on. And you can reduce it to a set of scientific components: leaf, bud, trunk, etc., etc. But it also still remains an object out there in space and time. But it's possible, and you may agree with this, that it's possible to encounter the tree at another level, where it's no longer just something in space and time. That doesn't disappear, but you have somehow an inner relationship with the tree, and I think, I don't claim to have it, but I think people claim to have such relationships with nature. It may be that, but then he says, when I have that relationship, this is how he describes it. I have been seized by the power of exclusiveness. Now, what does that mean? I've puzzled a long time. He says, in this I-thou relationship, it's exclusive. It's not a generalization. You're not making, oh, this person's like that person. I have the same experience. That's I-it. I-thou has a uniqueness, an exclusiveness about it. It's this. And it's very difficult to describe simply because it's of that nature. Exclusive, not generalized. He says, if you consider a human being as thou, is not a thing, he or she or it, not something to be experienced or described with so many qualities. The other is whole in herself or in himself. You meet the other whole. You don't meet the other as a psychological phenomenon where you explain, oh, that's because of this, and not because of the parents, not because of etc. You meet it in a certain wholeness as the other. It doesn't mean that nothing or no one else exists. And this is what he puts it. All else lives in the light of this experience. I do not experience the one to whom I say thou, but I take my stand in relationship to him or her in the sanctity of the primary word, I thou. Only when I step out of it do I experience him or her once again, chatty, interesting, etc. Now I want to read you the I thou in nature. It's written by an American, and this American was a hunter in the West. He hunted wolves, he hunted all sorts of animals, he was a hunter. But he was also a person who knew all about nature. The plants, the rocks, the mountains, everything. He's an extraordinary man. He's called Aldo Leopold. And he was writing in the time of the Second World War, really. But I think this book was, I'm not sure, published about 1960 or something. He talks about his experience with a wolf. He was accustomed to go out and kill wolves, and he did that regularly. With the idea it was good to kill a wolf, and because wolves were always eating the deer, and if you killed wolves, you'd have more deer, and that would be better. But he also talks about a mountain, a relationship to a mountain. A deep, chesty bawl echoes from rim rock to rim rock, rolls down the mountain, and fades into the far blackness of the night. It's an outburst of wild, defiant sorrow and of contempt for all the adversities of the world. Everything living, and perhaps many a dead one as well, pays heed to this call. To the deer, it's a reminder of the way of all flesh. To the pine, a forest of midnight scuffles and of blood upon the snow. To the coyote, a promise of gleanings to come. To the cowman, a threat of red ink at the bank. To the hunter, a challenge of fang against bullet. Yet behind these obvious and immediate hopes and fears, there lies a deeper meaning, known only to the mountain itself. Only the mountain has lived long enough to listen objectively to the howl of a wolf. Those unable to decipher the hidden meaning know, nevertheless, that it's there, for it is felt in all wolf country and distinguishes that country from all other land. It tingles in the spines of all who hear wolves by night or see their tracks by day. Even without sight or sound of wolf, it is implicit in 100 small events: the midnight whinny of a pack horse, the rattle of rolling rocks, the bound of a flashing deer, the way shadows lie under the spruces. Only the ineducable tyro can fail to sense the presence or absence of wolves, or the fact of the mountain has a secret opinion about them. So that's the mountain. And then he tracks a wolf, and he sees a wolf and a cub, and he shoots, and the wolf is wounded and lies there, and the cub scrambles away, wounded. And he goes up to the dying wolf. In those days, we had never heard of passing up a chance to kill a wolf. In a second, we were pumping lead into the pack, but with more excitement and accuracy. How to aim a steep downhill shot is always confusing. When our rifles were empty, the old wolf was down, and a pup was dragging a leg into impassable slide rocks. We reached the old wolf in time, watch a fierce green fire dying in her eyes. I realized then, and have known ever since, that there was something new to me in those eyes, something known only to her and to the mountain. I was young then, and full of triggerage. I thought that because fewer wolves meant more deer, that no wolves would mean hunter's paradise. But after seeing the green fire die, I sensed that neither the wolf nor the mountain agreed with such a view. When I read this man says who's not a hunter, who's not connected with nature, I realized there are people who live this I-thou with the nature, and that encounter with the wolf completely changed this man's whole livelihood, attitude. Now, Buber has been criticized for being vague, mystical, for conjuring up poetic images that are not grounded in real life. No doubt he is not the empirically minded one, but nevertheless, his is a voice that resonates strongly in a world so given to the I-it. It's a world of quantities where all performance has to be measured. For example, the relation doctor-patient, teacher-pupil, child-childminder. These risk being isolated in the attitude of I-it, and I-thou becomes suspect. The word dialogue fills the air. Manager with worker, president with president, oppressor with victim. It's yearned for as the answer to the unsolvable. And Buber is the clearest exponent of this essential meaning. I'm going to read you another part on page 11. The thou meets us through grace. It's not found by seeking. But my seeking of the primary word to it is an act of my being, is indeed the act of my being. The thou meets me, but I step into direct relationship with it. Hence, the relation means being chosen and choosing. So it's quite a different kind of relationship from I-it. There's a kind of mutuality about it, which is not there in the I-it. Hence, the relationship means being chosen and choosing, suffering and action in one. Just as any action of the whole being, which means the suspension of all partial actions and consequently of all sensations of actions grounded only in their particular limitations, is bound to resemble suffering. That's quite a difficult sentence, that. The primary word I-thou can be spoken only with the whole being. Concentration and fusion into the whole being can never take place through my agency, nor can it ever take place without me. I become, through my relationship to the thou. As I become I say thou. All real living is meeting. So I understand what he's saying is that in this relationship, we don't search for something which might be interesting or attractive or whatever. It comes towards us, and at the same time we choose it. There's a mutuality in this coming together in the I-thou. And then in the I-thou, also the I becomes truly the I of the I-thou, and not just its own independent self. So the other helps me to become myself, is I think what he's saying. We can't become ourselves without the other. So he's questioning what we might call self-development. All I need to do is go into a cave and I can develop myself. I've read about people who've done that. And he says, no, development is always in and with the other. So that seems to me quite important. Okay, just another comment. I'm going to make several perceptions about different aspects of life which he brings into this whole concept of I, thou, I-it. And he says about the whole question of love, for example. It's usually thought that in relationships, love is directed by feelings. These, Buber maintains, accompany the fact of love, but do not constitute it. So love is not just a feeling. It's not that. So what is it? The accompanying feelings can be of many different kinds. Feelings are entertained, as we say, but love, this is how he puts it, love comes to pass. That's a biblical term. To come to pass means happens. Love happens. It's interesting. Love happens, comes to pass. Feelings dwell in the human being, but the human dwells in his or her love. There's no metaphor. Love does not cling to the I in such a way as to have the thou only for its content as object. Love is between the I and the thou. Without it, the distant one, the object, one cannot live. He who lives with it alone is not a man. Now, I have a quote. Buber was fortunate to have a German book who wrote on all his work. He calls it The Life of Dialogue, and he unfolds all the research he's done on the background of Ufer and so on. It's a wonderful book, which I have, and I've taken a little quote from it, and that is concerning the life of it. What is it? Living in it. What's it like? And he puts it like this. He imagines people today, they live in factories, work in factories, they work in institutions, they work in all sorts of complicated organizations, and so on. And then there's the individual opposite that. And he says, in the world of it, then, of course, in an organization like a factory, how do you make nails? So you have to get the steel in or whatever, all the operations that go through, and people have to attend to these, and it's all it. You're dealing with objects, and you're arranging and so on. And on the other hand, so there's the factory. Let's take a factory that is going through all these necessary operations, and you have to have a very distancing connection with it. The materials, the right material, and so on and so on. And then there's the feelings of the worker. In the whole situation, everyone has carry their own feelings of being happy working here or being terrible because it's all it. There's no relationship of I-thou. It's all I-it. And so you have to go through that for 8 hours a day or whatever, for 7 days or 5 days a week. And so he then puts it like this. Neither institutions, which are the factories and so on, nor feelings, know man to have access to real life. Institutions know only the specimen. Feelings know only the object. The institutions yield no public life, is realized by many with increasing distress, and is the starting point of the seeking need of the age. But few realize that feelings yield no personal life, for feelings seem to be the most personal life of all. Modern man has learnt to be wholly concerned with his own feelings, and even despair at their unreality will not instruct him in a better way, for despair is also an interesting feeling. The solution to this lack of real public and personal life is not freedom of feeling, writes Buber. True community arises through people taking their stand in living mutual relationship with a living center, and only then through being in living mutual relationship with other community can be set up as a goal and directly attained by, but can only result from a group of people being united around a central goal, the relationship to the eternal thou. If you look out and see anything happening in the world, you always expect it to have a cause. There's nothing. Can you imagine anything that doesn't have a cause? You see a leaf falling from a tree, and there must be a cause for that. So somebody must have released a leaf. There's a sound coming from somewhere. Well, it must be a bird or something like that. So you immediately assume, is there anything that you assume has no cause? You live in the world of causality. You feel depressed? Oh, it must be a cause. Go and see the doctor. He'll tell you. Or whatever. You don't feel good when you wake up in the morning. Oh, I must have eaten something. You look for a cause. And so we are surrounded and live in a world of cause. And that means we can feel that really everything is bound. There's no issue. There's no exit from this world of causality. He puts it this way. all physical and psychical events are subject to causality. Physical events like an illness, or psychic events like feeling depressed or feeling have a holiday or whatever. These are subject to causality. Something is causing them. This is of fundamental importance for the scientific ordering of the world. The human being is not limited to the world of it. He can continually leave it for the world of relation. Here the human being has freedom both of his being and of being, capital B, the large being. Only if we know relation and the world of thou are we capable of decision. He who decides is free, for he has approached what he calls the face, which is an expression from the book of Job, the face of God. He puts it like that, he's exposed to spirit, we might say. Freedom, therefore, is for him a question of being in the I-thou. There is freedom. There you step out of causality. You are not responding or judging or evaluating or anything like that. You are open to what is in the I-thou relationship. Then he talks about, and I'll just read this, fate and destiny. Destiny and freedom are solemnly promised to each other. So people talk about destiny, and they also talk about to be free. Are they contradictions? Are they in opposition to each other, or what? Destiny and freedom are solemnly promised to one another. Only the one who makes freedom real to himself meets destiny. Freedom has to become real in order that we encounter our destiny. Arbitrary will, self-will, I'm going to achieve this, whatever. Arbitrarily decided, I will do this, I will achieve this will make me achieve my goals. This is fate. Then you meet your fate. He contrasts between destiny and fate. The free man is he who wills without arbitrary self-will. He must sacrifice his puny, unfree will that is controlled by things and instincts to his grand will. Buber challenges the pervasive view that is always in pursuit of goals, teleological development, we can call it. For Buber, this means an abdication of responsibility. The dogma of process leaves no room for freedom, none for its most real revelation of all, whose calm strength changes the face of the earth. I call this reversal. This dogma does not know the man who through reversal surmounts the universal struggle, tears to pieces the web of habitual instincts, raises the class band and stirs, rejuvenates, and transforms the stable structures of history. This dogma allows you in its gains only the choice to observe the rules or to retire. But the man who is realizing reversal overthrows the pieces. The dogma is always willing to allow you to fulfill the limitations with your life and to remain free in your soul. But the man who is realizing reversal looks on this freedom as the most ignominious bondage. The only thing that can become fate for a man is belief in fate, for this suppresses the movement of reversal. The uniqueness of the human being is to be found neither in the individual nor in the collective, but in the meeting of I and thou. And then he talks about existentialists who talk about the individual who was carrying the burden of life and so on, and it was very burdensome and difficult, like the French existentialists of 50 years ago. So all real living is meeting. The basis of this realization is a twofold movement in the human being. Making a distance is prior to making a relation. So he's been talking about I-it as if it was something that we ought to avoid, but it's not really that. You have to go through I-it in order to come to the I-thou. They're twinning in some way. You can't have the one without the other. And if you go back to primitive man, then you could see that he lived entirely in an I-thou. He was with nature, he was with his gods, he was with his tribe. There was no separate individual who was standing against it. But in order to come to what he calls the I-thou, you have to go through from the primitive stage, if you like to call it that, to the I-it, of making the world around us of things and machines and so on, in order now to discover anew, in our new consciousness, the I-thou. All real living is meeting. The basis of this realization is a twofold movement in the human being. Making a distance is prior to making relation. When an independent world, a continuum which includes own experience and others, has been formed, then one can enter into relation. In this, the other is perceived as a whole, as a unity. Buber calls this a synthesizing perception. Through this relation, people confirm each other, becoming a self with the other. The instinct, the inmost growth of the self, is not induced by man's relation to himself, but by the confirmation in which one person knows himself or herself to be made present in the uniqueness of the other. Self-realization is not a goal, but a byproduct. The I of the primary word I-thou is a different I from that of the primary word I-it. The I of the primary word I-it makes its appearance as individuality and becomes conscious of itself as a subject. The I of the primary word I-thou makes its appearance as a person. He distinguishes between the idea, the individual, and the person. The idea of the primary word I-thou makes its appearance as person and becomes conscious of itself as subjectivity. Well, I'm not quite sure how to express that. It becomes conscious of itself inwardly as now person. Individuality makes its appearance by being different from other individuals. A person makes its appearance by entering into relationship with other persons. The one is the spiritual form of natural detachment, the other the spiritual form of natural solidarity of connection. So the one individuality isolates us from the others, and that's the world we so much live in, with the I-it, but the I-thou brings us into connection. The aim of self-differentiation is to experience and to use, and the aim of those is life, that is, dying that lasts the span of a man's life. So if we only concern ourselves with I-it, it's a kind of eternal permanent death that we're living. The aim of relation is relation's own being, that is, contact with the thou. For through contact with every thou, we are stirred with a breath of the thou, that is, the eternal one. He who takes a stand in relation shares in a reality that is, in a being that neither merely belongs to him, nor merely lies outside him. All reality is an activity in which I share without being able to appropriate for myself. When there is no sharing, there is no reality. When there is self-appropriation, there is no reality. The more direct the contact with the thou, the fuller is the sharing. For me, there's something immediately attractive, relevant to real living and being with people, and at the same time it has many questions. And of course, being a student of Steiner, I have all sorts of other questions. And I try to, at least I don't busy myself with saying, comparing them and saying one says this and one says that, who's right. That's not interesting for me. It's interesting that alongside a person like Steiner, he knew of Buber. He certainly knew of Buber's work. I don't know what comments he made, and I'm not sure, Buber must have known of Steiner, but he couldn't follow that way. That's not, to me, the significance of my connection with Buber. It seems to me that there are, in all ways, whenever you take up a worldview like that of Steiner, it always presents new problems. new difficulties. It must, because life changes. We are no longer living in the world that Steiner spoke to, and even then, of course, it was full of problems for his contemporaries. And so it is for us. And then we look and see, and we must ask ourselves, what is it that we are looking for today? And then so I turn to Buber, and for me I say, this man is saying something that seems to me very relevant. And when I see that young people are growing up with a relationship through the machine, which I'm not saying it shouldn't happen, because there are extraordinary connections also come there, which are I, thou, no doubt about that. But nevertheless, the prevalence of the machine in our interrelationship seems immediately to be a tendency towards the I-it. So are we living entirely in a world of I-it? How do we overcome it? Do we have to do something that we're not doing? And what is that? What does it mean to the different generations? And so on. So it raises questions, but it also poses a kind of sense of what's missing, possibly, in myself and in others, and in our culture. And how does one then, out of oneself, because it's not a program one's looking for, it's just a new step of what he calls reversal.